Hello, my name is Suerie Moon. I'm a professor of practice and co-director of the Global Health Center here at the Graduate Institute. Welcome back to Governing Pandemics 101. My mini lecture today is going to be focusing on the system for the development, production, and access to therapeutics and diagnostics for pandemics. Before I dive in, I also wanted to thank my colleague Marcela Vieira, who has contributed to the preparation of this mini lecture. My lecture will take place in across four different themes. So first, I'll speak about what the system for the development of therapeutics looked like prior to COVID-19. Second, I'll turn to what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Third, I'll look at what are some of the proposals on the table and what are some of the reform initiatives that have already been developed in response to some of the problems we saw during COVID-19. And last but not least, I'll spend just a couple quick minutes at the end commenting specifically on diagnostics and how they're different from therapeutics. But many of the things I'll be saying about therapeutics do apply to diagnostics as well. Let's dive into the first theme, which is indeed, what did the system look like prior to COVID-19? So as I mentioned, this lecture ties to our previous discussion of the importance of finding ways to make sure that pathogen samples and genomic sequencing data are rapidly shared in the earliest days of an outbreak, because these are really key informational resources that researchers and scientists need to begin developing diagnostics and in some cases therapeutics as quickly as possible. As with vaccines, of course, we don't know until a new pathogen has emerged, until an outbreak begins, what exactly it will look like. And oftentimes that means that we cannot begin developing diagnostics or drugs until after the outbreak occurs. That means that there's going to be a lag time, of course, but it also means that there's a lot of risk because, of course, a company, for example, doesn't know if a pathogen will ever emerge as an outbreak or an epidemic. And if it does emerge, it doesn't know what exactly, how exactly that pathogen will behave. What this means is that there's a lot of risk in the system. And as for vaccines, what we've seen is that it's really primarily government, it's public money that really drives and shapes the innovation system because it is too risky for the private sector to do. What we have seen, as with vaccines, is that there is a kind of specialized biosecurity research and development ecosystem that has emerged out of military R&D, and that this system is highly developed in just a handful of countries. The US, the UK, China, Russia, France, and Germany are sort of the major countries that have their own national systems. But as you can guess, these are systems very much focused on the national interest, on national security, and not at all traditionally looking outwards at how to make products available or meet the needs of a global community or of all countries. This means that priority setting for research and development also has happened primarily at the national level. One of the things that has changed is that after the West African Ebola crisis in 2014, WHO began playing a more active role with priority setting, and they have developed what's called the Research and Development Blueprint, where they identify a priority list of pathogens for which we need investment in drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines. And so there has been a shift in priority setting away from a strictly national level. Now let's move to what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So as with vaccines, what we saw when the virus began to spread was indeed a very rapid reaction, a very large-scale upsurge of R&D activities. And diagnostics were actually developed within days and weeks of the first data, the first genomic sequencing data, being shared in early January 2020 on this new virus. And efforts to begin developing drugs also happened very quickly. Today, we have 24 products that have been registered, received some kind of regulatory approval. We have over 800 other products that are in the pipeline. So you can see it's actually a very large-scale R&D effort that has emerged for therapeutics. When we look at diagnostics, we have today 2,800 diagnostics that have been developed. So an even larger scale set of activities for diagnostics. When we turn back to drugs, the first thing that many scientists did, what they did was they studied pre-existing drugs. So drugs that we knew were safe and effective in the human body against other diseases, for example, for malaria, for HIV, for fungal infections. And they looked at whether those drugs could be repurposed to also treat COVID-19. And we found that in some cases the answer was yes, and in other cases the answer was no. However, unlike for vaccines, where we have an international entity that tried to do some coordination on funding of R&D, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations does that for vaccines, we had no such entity for drugs or for therapeutics. And one of the consequences is that the international system for both R&D and access to drugs and diagnostics is much more fragmented. We don't actually have very good arrangements. We don't have clear rules. We don't have a funding entity. And what we had was a major increase in R&D activity with almost no coordination. One of the consequences of that is that a lot of the clinical trials that were run trying to test products to see if they were useful ended up not being useful. The information and knowledge that came out of those trials could not actually be used for decision making because of the trial design, or because information wasn't shared quickly, or because the sample size was too small. And this is indeed one of the big problems that we're currently trying to address in some of the reform processes. There are some important exceptions to that rule, such as the WHO Solidarity Trial, the UK-based Discovery Trial, and the COVID-19 Clinical Research Consortium, which was developed to try to increase the amounts of R&D for therapeutics that was happening in low and middle income countries. But by and large, this rapid global effort to identify and develop drugs that would be effective was uncoordinated. Nevertheless, we've had a number of important drugs that were developed, as I mentioned, 24 in total as of the recording of this lecture in May 2022. Some of these are biologics, which means they're sometimes called large molecule drugs, and a couple biologics that you may have heard of are sotrovimab, baricitinib, excuse me, not always easy to pronounce, but part of a class of products called monoclonal antibodies, or MABs. These were some of the first products that were developed. They are expensive to manufacture. They often require you to sit in a hospital and have an infusion over a number of days. Very difficult to use at a large scale, very difficult to use in low and middle income countries. And so some of the products that were developed later were actually much more relevant. So we have, as of the end of 2021, 2 small molecule drugs that were proven to be at least partially effective in treating COVID-19. One is called molnupiravir. The second, it goes by the brand name Paxlovid. Its generic name is long and hard to pronounce. I'm just going to call it Paxlovid. But one of the key differences with these 2 drugs is that they were small molecule, meaning they were relatively easy to produce. They could be low in cost, and they could be used easily by patients at home. So that wraps up the segment where I focus on innovation. Let's now look at the other side of the coin, which is about access to some of these products. At the international level, we had the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, which has a therapeutics arm and a diagnostics arm, and they tried to mobilize money internationally to purchase at large scale therapeutics and diagnostics for use in countries that were not going to be able to secure them. So we've had voluntary licenses negotiated through the Medicines Patent Pool for the Merck product, molnupiravir, and the Pfizer product, Paxlovid, that cover between 95 and 105 countries, which means those countries can access a generic version of those medicines. However, many upper middle income countries in particular are excluded, and it's one of the reasons why in those upper middle income countries today we are seeing efforts to get access to generic versions of those drugs through the use of compulsory licensing. The World Health Organization has also set up a voluntary pool for the sharing of technology called CTAP, or the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, which has now had a couple licenses contributed to it. And as I mentioned, a number of countries seeking to access drugs through compulsory licensing or through the TRIPS waiver. As mentioned also during the vaccine lecture, the TRIPS waiver as of May 2022 continues to be under discussion. No agreement yet on whether WTO members will be permitted to waive or to lift a wide range of intellectual property protections for technologies. 2 other measures that countries have used to try to improve access to some of these therapeutics. The first is opposing the grant of a patent before it is granted, sometimes called a pre-grant opposition, for example, in India and Thailand. And for least developed countries like Bangladesh, least developed countries are able to produce and manufacture drugs and other technologies because they are not required to implement the TRIPS agreement for quite some time. From all of these details, I think you can begin to see that the situation for drugs is actually quite different than for vaccines. Whereas with vaccines, overcoming intellectual property barriers doesn't get you all the way to being able to produce vaccines. You need technology transfer and access to know-how to be able to do that for vaccines. The situation with drugs is very different, where we have many more countries able to produce generic versions. The industrial capacity is more widespread, and oftentimes the patent, the intellectual property, is the main barrier, and once you can overcome that, many companies and many countries are able to rapidly produce generic versions and scale up access quickly. So this is an important distinction. Let me turn now to my third theme, where we're looking at some of the ongoing initiatives that have already begun to address or tried to address some of these problems that were made visible during COVID, as well as some of the proposals that are now on the table. So in terms of initiatives that have already been implemented, the European Union has created a new entity called the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, or HERA, and it's very much modeled off the US system. However, this is expected to focus primarily on Europe. It's not global in its scope, but it's expected to accelerate investment in therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics in future emergencies. In terms of trying to improve production capacity, WHO and the Republic of Korea have partnered to set up a new biomanufacturing training hub. And one of the reasons for this is that, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, we have a lot of capacity worldwide to manufacture small molecule drugs, but the capacity to manufacture biologics, and biologics were an important therapeutic option, that capacity is actually quite limited, and there's a need to improve and expand the number of countries able to manufacture biologics. We have also had at the World Health Assembly in May of 2022 a resolution that was passed on clinical trials in order to try to address some of the problems with the uncoordinated clinical trials that we saw during COVID-19, where governments are committing, among other measures, to share data, for example, much more openly and to work together so that that's not as chaotic as it was in the past. We do also have a number of initiatives to try to include access in the R&D process early on. There's an initiative called the COVID-19 Moonshot, which is an open access collaboration among a number of different partners to develop therapeutics for COVID-19 without patents so that they will be available worldwide and accessible worldwide by design. Let me turn now to some of the proposals that have not yet been implemented. So we have a proposal, for example, for CEPI to expand its mandate beyond vaccines and to include therapeutics and diagnostics. We have a number of proposals to include more conditions on public funding. As I mentioned before, a lot of the money that went into driving the development of drugs and diagnostics comes from governments, and yet we know that there were inadequate provisions to ensure that these would be made accessible worldwide. When we look at what's happening with the pandemic treaty negotiations, again, therapeutics and diagnostics will be high on the agenda, but at this point, we don't yet have clear proposals on the table for how some of these measures will be addressed. Similarly, there is a political agreement to create a new financial intermediary fund focused on pandemics. Some of that money is expected to go into research and development, production, and purchasing of therapeutics, but it remains unclear, indeed, how exactly that will look. Finally, in terms of priority setting and coordination, I think there's an expectation WHO would continue to play a role there, but unclear whether new arrangements will be put in place to do that. So when we turn back and look at what happened during COVID-19 in terms of access from the perspective of mid-2022, a number of countries are still unable to access therapeutics. There's still huge inequality in the level of testing that is happening, and it's quite clear that the arrangements we had at the international level to ensure that technologies would be developed and made accessible were wholly inadequate, fragmented, and really not up to the task. So there's a big reform agenda ahead of us still. As I promised, let me just turn for a minute now to the last section of my lecture and say just a few words about diagnostics. A couple things to recognize about the difference between diagnostics and therapeutics. One is that, if vaccines get the lion's share of attention, by one estimate, 50% of R&D funding for pandemics went to vaccines, 7% to drugs. We actually don't even know how much went into diagnostics, because it is really what has sometimes been called the Cinderella or the neglected stepchild of the technologies. And this remains to this day. However, we have many, many more companies and countries that are able to develop diagnostics very quickly. It's much lower cost than developing a drug or a vaccine. It requires a smaller firm that can be done very quickly. Manufacturing can begin very quickly. And that's one of the reasons why we have today 2,800 different diagnostics that are available. However, one of the big challenges is that for many countries, there's a very unclear regulatory pathway, which means it's hard for governments in many countries to actually assess, is a diagnostic of good quality? Is it going to be accurate, meaning sensitive and specific? Will it be manufactured at an appropriate level of quality assurance? And for this reason, the situation in many countries has been gray. It's been difficult to get diagnostics ramped up and accessible quickly. And this is different, again, from drugs and vaccines. What is very clear from the COVID-19 experience, however, I think there's a much greater appreciation of the importance of diagnostics. I'm sure many of you have now been tested many, many times for COVID-19. The critical importance this plays in being able to manage preparedness and response to pandemics has been recognized as never before. So we do hope that some of the reform efforts will address some of these challenges that I've identified with diagnostics. With that, I'll wrap up my lecture and we'll turn to the quiz questions. Thank you.